The alarm clock read 3:47 a.m. when Pastor David Matthews sat at his kitchen table, staring at a resignation letter he'd rewritten 17 times. After 23 years of ministry, countless weddings, funerals, and Sunday sermons that had touched thousands of lives, he was done. Not because of a scandal, not because of lost faith, but because he simply couldn't take another day of the crushing weight that had become modern pastoral ministry. David's story might sound like an isolated tragedy, but it's actually part of a devastating trend that's quietly dismantling American Christianity from within. Every month, approximately 2,500 pastors leave their ministry permanently. That's 50 pastors every single day walking away from pulpits they once felt called to occupy. To put this in perspective, if pastors were leaving at this rate during World War II, we'd be calling it a national emergency. But here's what makes this crisis truly chilling. Most of these departures happen in complete silence. No church announcements, no farewell sermons, no acknowledgement of what's being lost. These spiritual leaders simply vanish, leaving behind congregations, communities, and often their entire sense of identity. The numbers paint a stark picture that most Americans have never seen. In 1992, the average pastor stayed in ministry for over 20 years. Today, that number has plummeted to just 4 years. 4 years! That's barely enough time to learn the names of everyone in a small congregation, let alone build the deep relationships that ministry requires. We're watching the systematic collapse of one of America's oldest and most stable professions, and almost nobody is talking about it. What's driving this exodus? The answer is far more complex and heartbreaking than you might imagine. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we uncover the hidden stories that shape our world. If you're new here, we dive deep into the human stories behind historical trends, and today's investigation into the pastoral crisis is one of our most important yet. To understand how we got here, we need to travel back to a different era of American ministry. In 1952, Pastor William Hughes of First Baptist Church in Springfield could focus on what he'd trained for: studying scripture, counseling families, and delivering weekly sermons. His biggest administrative headache was organizing the annual church picnic. He had a secretary who handled correspondence, deacons who managed finances, and a community that largely respected his authority and expertise. Fast forward 70 years, and today's pastor faces a job description that would terrify most CEOs. Modern pastors are expected to be expert theologians, engaging public speakers, skilled counselors, social media managers, fundraising specialists, building maintenance supervisors, human resources directors, event planners, and often the primary breadwinners for their families, all while maintaining the spiritual depth and availability that their calling demands. Pastor Sarah Chen discovered this reality the hard way. Fresh out of seminary in 2019, she accepted her first position at a mid-sized church in Ohio with boundless enthusiasm. "I thought I'd spend my days in prayer, study, and meaningful conversations with people seeking spiritual guidance," she recalls. "Instead, I found myself troubleshooting the church's Wi-Fi at 10 p.m., mediating disputes about carpet colors, and managing a social media presence that demanded constant content creation." But the expanded job description is just the beginning of the story. The real crisis lies in what researchers call emotional labor overload, a phenomenon that's literally killing pastors. Dr. James Peterson, who has studied pastoral health for over 2 decades, describes it this way. Imagine being a therapist, but your clients can fire you if they don't like your advice. Imagine being a teacher, but your students' parents control your salary. Imagine being a performer, but your audience expects you to be perfect, not just on stage, but in every aspect of your personal life. That's the impossible position we've created for modern pastors. The statistics are staggering. Pastors have higher rates of depression than the general population, with 23% reporting severe depression compared to 8.5% of other adults. They're 40% more likely to divorce than other professionals, and their children are statistically more likely to reject faith entirely. Perhaps most shocking of all, pastors have the second highest suicide rate among all professions, trailing only medical doctors. Pastor Michael Rodriguez learned about this pressure firsthand when his teenage daughter was arrested for underage drinking. Instead of receiving support during a family crisis, he faced immediate calls for his resignation. The congregation seemed to believe that if I was a good pastor, my children would be perfect. He remembers. They forgot that I was human, that my kids were human, and that faith doesn't make families immune to struggle. This expectation of perfection extends into every corner of pastoral life. Pastor Jennifer Walsh was criticized by church members for shopping at Target instead of supporting local businesses, for driving a car that was too nice for a minister, and for posting vacation photos on social media when people in the congregation were struggling financially. She lasted 2 years before burning out completely. The financial pressure adds another devastating layer to this crisis. Contrary to popular belief, most pastors aren't living comfortably. The median salary for pastors in America is $47,000 per year, well below the national average. But here's the cruel irony. While earning less than most professionals, pastors face unique financial constraints that other workers don't experience. They can't take side jobs without raising questions about their commitment to ministry. They're expected to donate generously to their own churches while supporting their families on below-average incomes. They often can't write off work expenses that other professionals can claim, because the IRS treats parsonages and church facilities differently than typical business expenses. Pastor Tom Bradley, a father of 3, describes the impossible math. I was making $45,000 a year while being expected to attend every church function, counsel families in crisis at all hours, and maintain a home that was welcoming to anyone who needed help. My wife couldn't work evenings because that's when most church activities happened, and I couldn't take a second job because the congregation expected total availability. We were slowly drowning financially, but asking for a raise felt like admitting I wasn't truly called to serve. The loneliness factor might be the most heartbreaking aspect of this crisis. Pastors consistently report feeling isolated, with 70% saying they have no close friends. This isolation isn't accidental, it's built into the role itself. Pastors can't easily become close friends with congregation members without accusations of favoritism. They can't discuss their struggles with church leaders who have the power to fire them. They can't vent about work frustrations with fellow pastors from other denominations without seeming disloyal to their own church traditions. They exist in a professional and personal vacuum that would drive most people to desperation. Pastor Lisa Thompson describes the crushing loneliness. I performed dozens of weddings and felt joy for every couple, but when my own marriage was struggling, I had no one to talk to. I couldn't tell church members because they expected me to have perfect relationships. I couldn't tell other pastors because word travels fast in small communities. I sat in my office every day, surrounded by people who loved and respected me, and felt completely alone. But perhaps the most insidious factor driving pastors away is what sociologists call weaponized scripture. Congregation members increasingly use biblical passages as ammunition against their pastors, twisting spiritual language to justify personal grievances or power struggles. Pastor David Kim experienced this phenomenon when he suggested the church needed to update its outdated sound system. Several longtime members accused him of being materialistic and focused on worldly concerns rather than spiritual matters. When he preached about loving immigrants, he was accused of being political. When he avoided political topics entirely, he was criticized for being irrelevant and afraid to speak truth. Every sermon became a minefield, Kim recalls. No matter what I said, someone found a way to use scripture to prove I was wrong, unfaithful, or unfit for ministry. They turned the very book I dedicated my life to studying into a weapon against me. The rise of social media has amplified these problems exponentially. Pastors now face public criticism that can go viral within hours. A poorly worded Facebook post can destroy decades of ministry. A sermon illustration that lands wrong can be recorded, edited, and shared across the internet, stripping away context and nuance. Pastor Rebecca Martinez learned this lesson painfully when a joke she made during a youth sermon was taken out of context and shared on TikTok with the caption, "Pastor mocks mental health struggles." Within 48 hours, she was receiving death threats from strangers across the country. despite the fact that the full sermon was actually about the importance of seeking help for depression and anxiety. Social media turned every moment of my ministry into potential ammunition for critics, Martinez explains. I stopped being authentic because I knew any human moment could be weaponized against me. But when you stop being human in ministry, you stop being effective. It was an impossible situation. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated these trends in devastating ways. Pastors suddenly became public health officials, technology specialists, and crisis counselors all at once. They faced angry congregants who disagreed with safety protocols, struggled to maintain community while physically separated, and watched their church's financial support evaporate as unemployment soared. Pastor Stephen Wright describes the pandemic period as ministry on steroids. He was simultaneously expected to master live streaming technology, provide constant emotional support to grieving families, navigate political divisions over mask mandates, and keep his church financially afloat while attendance plummeted. I worked 80-hour weeks for 2 years straight, he remembers. By the end of 2021, I couldn't remember why I'd ever felt called to ministry in the first place. The ripple effects of this pastoral exodus extend far beyond church buildings. Rural communities are particularly devastated, as small-town pastors often serve as unofficial social workers, counselors, and community organizers. When these spiritual leaders disappear, entire communities lose crucial support systems. Dr. Amanda Foster, who studies rural sociology, explains the broader impact. In many small towns, the pastor is the person who organizes disaster relief, runs the food bank, provides free counseling, and serves as a neutral mediator for community conflicts. When pastors leave and churches close, these communities lose far more than spiritual leadership. They lose essential social infrastructure. The crisis is creating what researchers call religious deserts, geographic areas where people have little or no access to spiritual communities. This phenomenon disproportionately affects elderly populations, low-income families, and rural residents who depend on churches for both spiritual and practical support. Here's a question for you watching today. Where in the world are you tuning in from, and what time is it where you are? I'm curious about our global community and whether this crisis resonates with religious leadership challenges in your part of the world. Also, what's your profession? I wonder if any of you watching are pastors yourselves, or perhaps you've witnessed this exodus in your own communities. But there are signs of hope emerging from this darkness. Progressive churches and denominations are beginning to acknowledge the unsustainable nature of traditional pastoral expectations. Some are experimenting with team-based ministry models that distribute responsibilities among multiple leaders. Others are providing better mental health support, more realistic job descriptions, and genuine sabbatical opportunities. The Lilly Endowment, one of America's largest foundations, has invested over $200 million in pastoral wellness initiatives, funding everything from counseling services to sabbatical programs. Early results suggest that pastors who receive this support are significantly more likely to remain in ministry long-term. Pastor Maria Santos found new life in ministry through one of these innovative programs. After burning out completely and leaving pastoral work for 3 years, she joined a church that employed a team ministry model. Instead of carrying the entire burden alone, I work with a team of specialists, she explains. We have someone focused on administration, someone dedicated to counseling, and someone who handles community outreach. I can actually focus on the theological and spiritual work I was trained for. Some churches are also revolutionizing their approach to pastoral accountability. Instead of treating pastors as employees who can be fired at will, they're creating covenant relationships that provide job security while maintaining appropriate oversight. These churches recognize that spiritual leadership requires the kind of long-term thinking that's impossible when someone fears for their job every Sunday. The emerging generation of seminary students is also demanding change. They're negotiating contracts that include mental health benefits, clearly defined work hours, and protection from arbitrary dismissal. They're refusing to accept the martyrdom complex that previous generations of pastors embraced, insisting instead on sustainable ministry practices. Dr. Ellen Rodriguez, who directs a major seminary, notes this generational shift. Today's seminary students have watched their mentors burn out and leave ministry in devastating numbers. They're determined not to repeat those mistakes. They're asking hard questions about work-life balance, financial sustainability, and emotional health that previous generations considered unspiritual. Technology, often seen as part of the problem, is also creating solutions. Digital platforms allow pastors to connect with colleagues nationwide, sharing struggles and finding support in ways that weren't possible before. Online counseling services specifically designed for religious leaders are providing safe spaces for pastors to address their mental health needs without fear of judgment. Some denominations are experimenting with circuit rider models, reminiscent of early American frontier ministry, where one pastor serves multiple small churches rather than trying to sustain full-time ministry in declining rural communities. These arrangements can provide better financial support while acknowledging the reality of demographic changes in rural America. The most promising developments focus on redefining success in ministry. Traditional metrics, church growth, budget increases, new members, are being supplemented with measures of community health, pastoral wellness, and long-term sustainability. Churches are beginning to value longevity over rapid growth, recognizing that sustainable ministry requires patient investment in relationships and systems. If you found this investigation valuable and want to support the work we do here at Professor Archive, consider leaving a super thanks. It helps us continue uncovering these important hidden stories that shape our world. But perhaps the most important change is happening in pews across America as congregation members begin to understand their role in either perpetuating or solving this crisis. Churches that thrive in the coming decades will be those that treat their pastors as human beings rather than spiritual superheroes. They'll provide realistic job descriptions, fair compensation, genuine support during personal struggles, and the kind of grace they hope to receive when they face their own failures. The story of Pastor David Matthews, who we met at the beginning, has an unexpected ending. After leaving ministry in 2019, he spent 2 years working in corporate training and development. The skills he'd developed in ministry, public speaking, counseling, leadership, translated well to the business world, and he found the work fulfilling in its own way. But in 2021, a small church approached him with a different kind of opportunity. They offered him a part-time position with clearly defined responsibilities, competitive compensation, and a covenant relationship that provided job security. They'd learned from the failures that drove away their previous 3 pastors, and they were determined to do better. It's not the ministry I originally imagined, Matthews reflects, but it's sustainable in a way that my previous position never was. I can actually focus on the spiritual and pastoral work I love because I'm not drowning in administrative tasks and unrealistic expectations. More importantly, I can be human without fear of losing my calling. Today, Matthews leads a congregation of 150 people who understand that their pastor is a person, not a product. He works reasonable hours, takes real vacations, and admits when he doesn't have all the answers. His marriage is thriving, his children respect his work, and he's rediscovered the joy that drew him to ministry in the first place. His story offers a glimpse of what American Christianity could become if we're willing to acknowledge the silent crisis driving spiritual leaders away from the work they once loved. The exodus of pastors isn't just a religious problem. It's a community crisis that affects social support systems, mental health resources, and the fabric of civil society itself. The choice facing American churches is stark. Continue demanding the impossible from pastoral leaders and watch ministry collapse under its own unsustainable weight, or reimagine what faithful leadership looks like in the 21st century. The pastors who remain in ministry, the communities they serve, and the future of American religious life all depend on which path we choose. The silent crisis doesn't have to remain silent, and it doesn't have to be permanent. But solving it will require the same kind of grace, wisdom, and commitment to transformation that the best pastors have always brought to their calling. The question isn't whether American Christianity will survive this crisis. It's what form it will take when it emerges on the other side. As we've seen throughout history, institutions that refuse to adapt to changing circumstances rarely survive intact. But those that embrace necessary change while maintaining their core purpose often discover renewed strength and purpose. The future of pastoral ministry may look different from its past, but that doesn't mean it has to be less meaningful or effective. The men and women dedicating their lives to spiritual leadership deserve our support, understanding, and realistic expectations. The communities that depend on their service deserve leaders who are healthy, sustainable, and equipped for long-term ministry. And the faith traditions these pastors represent deserve to be passed on by leaders who haven't been crushed by the very system they're trying to serve. The silent crisis is real, devastating, and urgent, but it's not insurmountable. The question is whether we'll find the courage to address it before it's too late.